racial equity at nonprofit organizations. So the question has really come up. Everybody's talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most of the work that we're doing, we run into the question pretty quick. What do we do? Where do we start? Or we don't know exactly where to start. So I think today's session is going to touch upon a few options, or at least a couple of options for organization leaders as a way to think about, okay, so what do we do next if we want to move beyond being thoughtful or having higher awareness about diversity, equity, and inclusion or justice issues at our organizations? What do we do next? Let me do a quick introduction of our Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy here. And again, thank you all for joining us. But our mission here is to support the vibrancy of the nonprofit sector, of course, here in the state of Texas and beyond. And we tend to focus on our research activity, our professional outreach opportunities. What we're doing today would fall under that category of outreaching to folks like yourselves that are working in the industry, volunteering in the industry, and engaged learning. Of course, we're a graduate school. So we like to ensure that our students also have access to things outside of the classroom that might complement their education while here. Our values at the nonprofit center here is nonprofits, of course. We value the organizations that we advocate and work on behalf of. The opportunity for all, we'll talk about that a little bit today. That's really our diversity statement in terms of how we think about diversity here. The opportunity for everyone to be able to participate in philanthropy, charity, progress as leaders within the industry, all of that. When we look at our expertise here in the center, from a research standpoint, of course, Dr. Will Brown, who's with us today, focuses on board governance and has for quite a while. We'll talk about a bit of that today. My background is more in the leadership studies space, and back to that engagement piece. Working with nonprofit organizations is highly important to us, and having touches like this with you all, we just wouldn't be who we are without the engagement opportunities that we focus on and that we have you join us so that we can learn together. I'll go through some definitions of equity just to kind of set the tone today. Some of you all have seen this, but I tend to always go back to just a brief look at what the leader demographics look like within the nonprofit sector, both staff leadership, so executive directors, CEOs of nonprofit organizations, and also board volunteers or volunteer leaders at organizations. I'll touch base on a few of some more recent studies in the nonprofit management and leadership space related to equity and assessment. And then we'll talk about, give you a sample tool that you can use, because that's kind of where I think we've moved on to. What can we use to assess our organization is a question that we've received. What do we do? What should we use? There's a couple of options out there. Primarily, they kind of say the same things, but I'll give you a sample of a tool that we'll share with you after the fact that we'll absolutely put up on our research page for you all to have, our resource page, as I say, for you all to have access to, for any of you all that then want to look at that a little bit deeper at your organizations. And then after you assess, what do you do to build racial equity at your organizations? The literature is coming right back, or works its way right around to really what we're talking about are change concepts. I mean, only in the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, of course, for a long period of time. What research is telling us is that awareness has certainly been raised, but what do we do in terms of if we want to move beyond that and actually make change at our organizations? And then, of course, we'll do a wrap up and do some question and answers at the end. So in terms of, generally thinking about equity at nonprofit organizations, one of the definitions that I like from some of the Race to Lead research is an awareness of how systemic inequities have affected our society and those an organization serves, enables them to avoid blind spots at organizations that can lead to, strategies that we think work well at our organizations, but that creates powerful opportunities to deepen an organization's impact relevance, and mission. And so when you look at some of the diversity research that's out there, it's said over and over at this point that organizations that are more culturally or racially diverse have the opportunity to advance their mission. And so as a former practitioner myself, when I reflect on the 20 years that I had in the industry, my job as a nonprofit executive was to advance my mission. And so I look at this just as another tool that you can have in your back pocket as a way to get there. But there's so many questions out there. That's why we want to, or personally, certainly why I focus in this area quite a bit and have for a while. Another definition that I found interesting was giving everyone what they need to thrive, based on an understanding that different people start in different places. So if you think about your staff at your organizations, how they come in, everybody comes in starting in different places. And so what's our responsibility to understanding how folks come to us? That might be similar to some of the leadership theory of understanding what competencies a person has when they walk through the door. We understand that they have a certain education level, they suit a qualification to come in and work with us, but everyone starts in different places. And so what we want to find, or where we want to work our way towards, kind of where some of this all started for me is how can we get to a place where there's equity and equal outcomes of who has the opportunity to lead nonprofit organizations. And I think that's been lopsided for quite a while. So again, I'll share some of that data with you just as sure as we move forward. So when we talk more about racial equity at nonprofit organizations, that's when we get into being thoughtful, conscious about eliminating race-based disparities so that race does not predict an outcome of who shows up where and what roles and positions at nonprofit organizations. And so, just a little earlier today, I've shared with my students in my social justice class that I lead here at the Bush School. It's funny to me, but when I was first hired as a CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Austin, I was the only Black employee at the organization at the time. And we had a staff of about 20 people. We grew to about 40. And that was just weird walking through the door. Like, who does that on some level? Or something that immediately I said to myself, that has to change. So then having the potential to improve outcomes for all. So one of the places that I've kind of stuck in when we think about racial equity at nonprofit organizations are the policies and procedures. And the way that that's defined in some of the, again, in the literature that's out there, is that that's what we would consider institutional racism. So when there's policies and procedures and practices that simply work better for white people than people of color at nonprofit organizations. And so what I've started to challenge my students to think about, both students here in the Bush School, but also professionals that work at organizations, is immediately go to your policies and procedures and what do they say. We'll get a little bit more specific about that, so I'll come back to that. But for now, I just wanted to make sure to provide the definitions for you. And then structural racism, and that's when it combines and compounds institutional racism into a system of power. So when I go to power, again, I'm going straight to the leadership stuff, that power dynamics at organizations. When we think more structural racism, is that's when there's a system of power that negatively impacts employees of color at nonprofit organizations. So again, that's just a primer to offer up some definitions in terms of how we're thinking about this stuff as we go through the rest of the presentation today. So again, just a quick reminder, some of you all have joined us before. This is information that's provided by Board Source, I think every 4 years. In 2017, you were saying, wow, when you look at nonprofit executives and CEOs and board leaders who identify as white, when you look at the column for 2017, that's tracked for 30 years approximately, where all executives and CEOs of nonprofit organizations, 90% identified as white. Board chairs at nonprofit organizations, 90% identified as white. Board members, all board members at nonprofit organizations, 84% identified as white. There's been so much focus in this area. So I started out with, we need to move beyond awareness. And so I think if you look on the right-hand side to 2021, which was the last time that the results of the board source study, the Leading with Intent study was put out, is now we see that there's been some progress in terms of further diversification or racial diversification, or when you just simply look at demographics at nonprofit organizations, that now we see that 87% identify as white executive directors and CEOs. Board chairs, 83% now identify as white. And then all board members, 78% is where we've seen the most progress in terms of overall board members at nonprofit organizations. When we say, definitely still lopsided, but all the conversations, all the focus in the last few years, we can see that there's been, some progress in that area. So a couple of recent studies that I came across, we would tend to go to, why does, again, something else that we talked about just a bit earlier today, so what is the business case would be the first thing that would come up, all those years ago as to, why is diversity or cultural diversity or racial diversity important at nonprofit organizations? So folks would ask about the business case. The business case tend to hover around, well, you can serve the people, you can serve your clients better, just as sure as you have more racially diverse organizations. You're more creative and innovative. Again, we'll get to some of that. It's actually mentioned in here. But a recent study just from 2021 talked about park supporting nonprofit organizations generate better park access for all racial and ethnic groups. But in that same study, they also found that more benefits accrue to whites than other racial ethnic groups. And so there, what the recommendation was at the end of the day for that particular study was to design better policies. So we go back to, where am I going to look if I walk into an organization to say consult with them or to look at what's going on, or if they have questions about what they can do, is to first off take a look at the policies that they have in place. So again, back to this study from 2021, design better policies and institutional structures to ensure equitable public service provisions. So the service delivery that they provide at their organization, what does that look like? And then a more recent one here from 2022, this was a study that was actually conducted over in New Orleans. So all nonprofit organizations in New Orleans. And what they found with this study is that while greater board diversity was associated with targeted programming and advocacy to support racially diverse communities and expanded service delivery, they also found that organizations that were or had more Black representation at the board level, they were operating with fewer reserves. So what they found is that those organizations were doing more with less money because in this sample, they had organizations that didn't have as much reserves as other organizations in the community there. So, and that one actually had to do with the pandemic. So in response to the pandemic, study that just was released not too long ago this year, found that organizations that have Black representation at the board level with fewer resources were doing more with less. But at the same time, as we found before, that those same organizations were really good at targeted programming for the population that they would serve. And I only reference the last one just from the standpoint as some of these same findings, go back as far as 1999 when, a study that found that member diversity or board member diversity and expertise are associated with better performing organizations. And back to that idea of that a more racially or culturally diverse organization promotes more creativity and innovation. And that kind of speaks more to a population of folks that you serve as clients, as nonprofit and public service leaders. So kind of on to kind of the crux of why you may be here today, and that idea of, so what do we do to assess organizations? So again, the next few slides basically represent a racial justice equity assessment that was produced by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and seems to potentially, that has the potential anyway to work well. What are the types of questions that they would ask to give organizations a rating for those that they actually fund? And so this is broke down in two different parts. The first part talks about staff competencies, and then the second part talks about internal operations at an organization. So what are some of those things that organizations can ask themselves? And again, this is just to give a primer, and I'll absolutely make sure that we get this up on our research page or resource page that you can have access to. And the cool thing about this one that I haven't found with other assessments is, and this may be a little controversial, but it actually gives organizations a score and talks about the things that you can do to get better. So if we were to go just to, a few of those questions, it asks, staff are trained and are knowledgeable at a very basic 101 level about the range of barriers to equal opportunity and the depth of embedded racial inequities, both how they're produced and how they can be reduced at an organization. So these are competencies that they expect staff to have. Staff having a deep level of understanding about barriers to opportunity embedded inequities in their specialty area of focus, including critical data and information about how inequities are produced and, again, how they can be reduced. Staff being comfortable and competent about discussing issues of barriers to opportunity and embedded racial inequities with relevant individuals and groups. So this is the one that tends to stick out quite a bit when we interact with organizations, and I alluded to it a little earlier. I go to, at nonprofit organizations, there seems to be a sense or feel of being extremely comfortable talking about how many people we served, going through a strategic planning process, developing fundraising plans. Again, all of this hard stuff that you would expect leaders to be responsible for. But then when we try to move beyond self-awareness, more awareness, if you will, related to diversity or equity and inclusion, there's this sense at organizations that folks are uncomfortable even having the conversation. So how do we get there? So that's an area that organizations can give themselves a score on. To what extent might you hear that conversation in passing at your organization? How many set meetings do you have where that's part of the agenda, whether it be at a board level or staff updates from supervisors to direct reports? The one that always comes up, again, part of what I tend to focus on just from the leadership literature is cultural competence. So staff exhibit some cultural competence in interactions with diverse groups. And I think the question there from the academic literature is, as a leader of an organization, what should we be responsible for in terms of our own knowledge of cultural competencies? Conversation that we had a little earlier basically had to do with, you have to localize that. Some of the research that's been done in the space is, what do we understand about behaviors and norms of people from different societies? And what should we know, generally speaking, as a well-rounded leader? That might be tough to know out in the whole entire world, but that might be super important for us to understand based on who makes up our staff at our organizations. Do we correctly pronunciate the names of the diversity of folks that are in our office? What holidays should we celebrate? what symbolism, what ceremonies might be important for us as a leader to make sure that we recognize when we think about we lead it and then our staff responds to the same thing in terms of creating that type or that sense of culture at the organizations that we lead. Continuing with the staff competencies, all cool areas as well too, but they ask about that staff disaggregate data by race in all analyses. So what do we actually know from data points related to the cultural and racial makeup at our organization versus a swipe across how folks responded and data that we collect at our organization. So it might be different with a breakdown like that of looking at the different cultures and how they respond to general questions that are asked across an entire organization. That a racial equity analysis is applied to policy issues. Racial equity analysis applied to what we do in practice, so practice issues as well. And do we have written material that reflects a knowledge and understanding of barriers to opportunity and embedded racial inequities? So the thing that I've gone to for a long time, and something else that's been highlighted and recognized in research for a while now is, of course, pay equity. Even if we weren't looking, of course, at race or culture, we know that pay equity causes people to leave the nonprofit industry. They go hand in hand, but we also know, of course, that when people don't have the opportunity for advancement or to promote within their organization, that's something else that will lead people to go. But what do we have written? What do we have from a policy standpoint that outlines those barriers to opportunity and any embedded racial inequities that we can identify? Definitely around those areas, again, because it's something that's tracked well in the research for nonprofits as to why people leave. But generally speaking, what do we have that reflects that? And then one that I like here, this is the last one on the staff competence side, is that staff can articulate the costs of failing to address barriers and opportunities and embedded racial inequities. And so, we've talked some about the costs associated when people leave. So there's one cost when people leave, there's another cost when superstars leave organizations. And if we have or not aware of what those costs are, then we might find ourselves in the same place spinning in terms of, aren't we supposed to be here to serve more people in a quality and safe way and advancing our mission versus staying in place from year to year, if you will. If we move over to the internal operations, and again, just to make sure that I reference it again, I think I put a little logo up in the corner when we first started, that this is from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and they actually have this survey that has been interesting to take a look at. They say these questions say some of the same things that I found in other ones, but I wanted to give you a specific tool. And then, of course, I'll reflect on some other generalities that I've seen in investigating or looking at a variety of assessment tools at this point. So when we go to the internal operations, thinking about how do we remove barriers to opportunity and disparity reduction are explicit goals of the work and articulated in a mission and vision statement. And so one place that I've started with my students, how do you open up a conversation with nonprofit leaders and you want to talk about social justice or social and racial equity at nonprofit organizations? Start with the mission, because that's usually where you start anywhere else. And is it represented within your organization's mission that you see something that alludes to a reduction of disparities and that's explicit in the work that you're trying to carry forward? The unit has an internal team that guides the ongoing work of removing barriers to opportunity and reducing racial disparity. I'm not saying anything that we haven't been through personally. Here at the school, the dean proudly raised his hand and said, I want to chair our diversity committee. We meet regularly, we have open conversations. He's put money behind it in terms of hiring folks to help us with this. There are some things that have become mandatory. I don't say any of this to say that we're doing a great job at this point, but we certainly have a lot of activity that speaks to this is important to us and something that he wants to carry forward as a leader. So for what that's worth in your own organizations. The organization has goals of reducing barriers to opportunity, and racial disparities are reflected in resource allocations. Again, something else that came up today. So, to what extent do when I led my own organization, again, I try to be transparent with this stuff. I can't say that at the time, so this was certainly a while ago, things have changed, but the conversation that I've had with my students has to do with you complete graduate school, you want to go out and be successful. I couldn't personally tell them that at the time, cultural and racial diversity was important to me. I wanted to be successful. But now that you are being educated as future public servants, how do you prioritize this stuff? And one of the things that will come up when you negotiate an offer somewhere is that you might negotiate what type of resources, financial resources, might you have access to ensure you continue to grow as a professional. And one add-on to that is, what is an organization doing these days to allocate resources to prioritize this thing around racial and cultural equity in our organizations? Is it important? Are there resources? Are there none? Is the organization moving in that direction? All questions that can be asked, or certainly ones that folks can reflect on as we think through this stuff. Investments promote capacity building and asset building for people of color. This is something that's been called on quite a bit. I mean, some of the research that's out there now, the way that it read for several years at this point is we need to make sure people of color are trained so that they're ready for these leadership opportunities. Okay, so now more the research speaks to that people of color have just as much education, just as much experience within these organizations. And why do the demographics look like the way that they do? Again, I'll complement that with there looks like there's been some progress in the last 4 years as we've tracked. I'm mostly talking about leadership roles, of course, in the executive roles, and also from the those that lead boards as volunteers. And then results of investments show opportunity for all and reduction of racial disparity. And not that that's where our particular value came from, but Dr. Will Brown was smart enough to say, we need to think about opportunity for all in terms of values or what we value here at our center, but it comes up when we think about this particular assessment tool is the opportunity for all and reducing racial disparity, the opportunity for all to participate in all of this good work. Some of the interviews that I've done with folks, people of color, and kind of those that kind of narrated those their experiences within the nonprofit sector, the one thing that really hurt when I was out there asking those questions myself had to do with those that had a bad experience at an organization as a volunteer, and then they didn't want to volunteer elsewhere. So they decided to leave the volunteerism, leave the charitable space, leave this philanthropic nature, maybe that they would have more broadly in their communities, versus something that that they would do more localized to, say, their neighborhood or with a family member's child, if you will, or something more localized to their immediate environment. Just to continue on, internal operations, that there's a deliberate plan to develop and promote leadership of staff of color. Again, we've talked about that a bit. That's been there for a long time. I think when you ask organizations this, I know when we talk about charitable organizations, Some of them, quite honestly, are too small for folks to navigate with opportunities like that. But that still does not mean that there's a requirement that leaders have to develop others. That's a primary thing when we think about leadership at an organization, is that to develop others is highly important to mission-based work based on the, relationship that it has with the organization moving in the right direction in terms of advancement of a mission. That there's regular trainings and discussions at the staff and or board level about removing those barriers and reducing racial disparities, both internally and externally. Who's leading the charge? I think I mentioned this a little earlier. To what extent are conversations happening at the board level when we talk about this? We haven't seen, a lot of that. I imagine that some of that's better than it once was, but set in stone as an agenda as to something that we discuss regularly. At staff level meetings, is this something that we're comfortable having the conversation? Something that they say that can certainly be assessed at an organization or an area for potential improvement, and to certainly an area that you would highlight with organizations doing the right things in these areas as well. That you assess workforce composition by race, ethnicity, and develop and implement strategies for increasing diversity levels. I mean, this is something that's been out there for a while. Again, I'm not talking anything that we aren't going through right here at the university. That's certainly a priority here from our new leadership at the president level at Texas A&M. How can we get, faculty members and staff that more mirror the student population that we have here at Texas A&M as a whole, and putting some money behind that? What does that look like at your respective organizations? And then, of course, back to the point that I made a little earlier, but it was interesting to find this one in there. The environment of the organization is multicultural. And when they talk about that, it's an environment of, how you celebrate food, art, holiday activities, those types of things, symbols, ceremonies that tend to be important when we're talking about racial equity at nonprofit organizations. And then the organization has a mechanism in place to address complaints about barriers to opportunity. The one thing that I found, I think I mentioned it in this, so just real quick, I'll come back to the point that I was going to make, but just real quick, this is kind of how it looks. So I haven't found many assessment tools that actually provide a score, but in this case it does. They look at staff competencies, the measurements at top, they give you a score. If you're 20 or below, think about incorporating racial equity into a mission and evaluate performance with it as an emphasis. There's been calls to put this in the performance of the executive director. How many people of color do you have in leadership roles? How many people of color did you invest in terms of training and actually preparing them for their next opportunity, whether it be at your organization, another member of your organization in another place, or at an organization completely different from the one that they're at currently? I won't go through all of this again. We'll provide this for you, but it was interesting to find that, because I felt like this might be fairly controversial in terms of providing a score with the sense that people might feel like this is a moving target. But it does provide some feedback along the lines of, that celebration piece as well too. So I guess if you get up to a score that's in the 30 or 39 range, continue to fine tune what you're doing. Continue to build up staff and organizational capacity. If you're high in score here, is to go deeper, pour more gasoline on it. We always talk about here, how do we institutionalize things that we want to be part of what's going on at our institutions. So putting in place strategies to ensure that we stay where we're at. So again, another conversation, just because it's so recent. We talked about in class today, it came up that Texas A&M finally hit the designation of being a Hispanic serving institution that 25% number. Okay, so what happens? Do we stop there? Do we go backwards? Or do we pour more gasoline on the things that we've been doing right to ensure that continues to grow? So again, however you think about that at your respective organizations. So I mentioned to you, that's one tool, NE, Casey, I want to make sure that I reference exactly where that comes from that we just went through. But other assessment questions that I found, again, I'm just generalizing or providing a sample of those based on others that I've seen that kind of say the same things, but stated in a different way. So does the executive director, CEO, or board of directors address racial inequities within formal organization updates to staff or within the agenda for board meetings? I mentioned that one already. Does the organization have a committee or informal task force who is responsible for addressing racial equity? So, you have an event, you're going to have a task force. You have something new going on at your organization, it's likely somebody's going to be named or asked to volunteer for the task force. So is there one on racial equity? Does the organization provide any type of formal training, sensitivity, well-being, cultural, for frontline staff who directly interact with the communities that you serve? And of course, we know, when we look across nonprofit organizations, many of them tend to operate in communities of color. So what do we do when folks walk through the door, along with the other types of training that they might receive, that they receive some sensitivity training in terms of how to work in communities of color? The story that I usually tell about that one is the day that a couple of my social workers who were responsible for going out and interviewing kids and families that we served, they wanted to buddy up, and where we would normally have one person go out and do that. In this case, they asked me, could two of us go out because they didn't feel comfortable in the neighborhood that we primarily operated in. And of course, at the time, it's a long time ago, but that really put me off, and my mind went straight to efficiencies, and that's not what the job is. And why don't you feel comfortable doing that? So, but my mind didn't go to maybe we should do some training for those folks because they're going to have to go in those communities, and that's part of the job. Are racial equity, diversity, equity, inclusion goals included within the strategic plan? Another place that I've encouraged those that I've worked with and students here, where do you look? If it's not policies or procedures, hit and miss, maybe at best, what do organizations say about this stuff in their strategic plan? Is it prioritized? Is it integrated in all those areas of an organization's strategic plan? I don't know, what that answer is, but that's another place that you can look if you wanted to assess yourself, or in looking at other organizations. What are you doing? I used to ask organizations all the time, would you mind sharing your strategic plan with me? I wasn't thinking at the time the racial equity stuff, but I wanted to see, what does it look like? What are you addressing? What are those areas of operations that are important for you at your organization as I'm trying to lead mine? And then, do definitive actions and consequences exist when people of color experience discrimination, direct, indirect, inadvertent, or intentional? I think that's a good one. And that's one where we always have a miss. We tend to say, go work it out with the person that you had the problem with. But what do our policies say? What are the consequences? Quite honestly, if someone does something racist in an organization, what happens? And I would say that, again, at best, it's hit and miss as to how things like that are addressed. So moving on to the building piece, just again, I'm going to go through this kind of quick, but another tool that I found, this is from a Race Forward document on building racial equity. They talk about change. So the way that they look at change is shared values, shared understanding, shared relationships, and shared tools. And then when we think about visualizing, just to understand, at least the way that they promote it, is that ultimately your organization or team should be able to articulate what racial equity would look like in your space. So are you taking any time to reflect on? Are you taking time to visualize as the leader responsible for your organization? What might that look like? Even if I haven't started anything, what could that look like at my organization? Normalizing, so turning racial equity vision into reality requires an understanding of the underlying drivers of inequities, along with the system that maintains those inequities. So how do we get to a place of this is just something that we do? And how do we make it normal versus maybe the way it feels currently that it's hard to talk about? Those shared relationships and organizing. So organizing seeks to kind of disrupt the status quo, rules, cultures, silos of work, and to build a power for putting forth new rules and new values and new practices. So how do we organize in a way to get away from the way that we've always done it and accepting that when we think about this space and how important it is, let's just say, to the future of the sector. And then shared tools. Having a racial equity agenda can start with small stuff, provided that they are scalable and replicable. I don't need to go, too far into the rest of that, but starting in a very small place has the potential, or you should structure it around having the potential to be something that you can do more of. I used to think about our work as a practitioner, as a leader of a nonprofit organization. When we have a strategic plan in place, when we have a strong board in place, when we have the financial resources in place, let's go do as much of our mission as we can. So when you have this small thing in place related to racial equity, let's go do more of it when we feel like we've hit a starting point, and that's something that we can replicate and potentially something that we set up to scale from the start. Things that we normally do anyways. So I mentioned just kind of to wrap up here, all of this really has to do with change. And so there's some old school ways to think about change, but one that I certainly like is Cotter's 8 steps in terms of leading change at an organization. And it's, pretty simple, as the leader, create a sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition, form the vision. Everybody needs that vision to chase after. Enlist an army. You need people to do this. You can't do it on your own. Remove barriers. I mean, that's all through everything that we talked about today. Those generating short-term wins. Celebrate the successes, no matter how small they are, because quite honestly, we're all starting at a very initial point when we talk about racial equity. Sustaining acceleration. One of the things that I've said, is the work important enough to sustain it? Is it important enough to sustain it like we sustain our revenue at our organization? That might be extreme, but how important is it? Institute change. We talked about what do you do to institutionalize something at your organization. So that's one way to maybe think about change at our organizations to help move this along. And then the other piece that's come up a bit that's been interesting to me. So in the leadership literature, we tend to think about transformational leaders. If you've ever heard anyone kick that around, that I'm a transformational leader, or there's folks that you admire because they inspire you, or intellectually you navigate to people that lead like that, or someone that has worked with you in a way to where they stimulate you the right way because they're ideal in your eyes as a leader. So transactional leadership, as I've looked at some of this stuff, I've said to myself, maybe transactional leadership might be better in terms of where we're at, in terms of thinking of what social, racial, equity stuff means at nonprofit organizations, because it just seems to move so slow. We've been talking about this stuff forever. So with transactional leadership, if there's another way maybe to exhibit change, is that This is when leaders exchange things of values with employees to advance their own and their employees' agenda. And so even though transactional approaches are limited in scope and they don't truly alter the status quo, maybe they can produce some short-term benefit for communities of color. But think of it as scaffolding for building towards more substantive change. So again, even though I traditionally don't think about transactional leadership as the place to be, a contingent reward for something, maybe that might help to move things along a little bit. And so even though this might be a corny example, but the example would be a supervisor negotiates with an employee that if he or she attends a DEI training, that it'll be taken into consideration for promotion. And then that leader gets people there, and then that looks good when their performance time rolls around. So again, just something to think about. But in closing, so we can make sure that we get to some questions that any of you all may have. And we've got a strong team here. I know Dr. Seaworth is with us. I know Dr. Will Brown is with us. Others are on here. We'd certainly welcome any questions that you have. But just in closing, what's at stake if we don't think about this a little bit more? And so I go straight to the leadership stuff. Everybody talks about it. Everybody wants to be a great leader. Everybody wants to promote it on social media, whatever it might be. But really, our own progress as leaders is what I believe is at stake if we don't think about how do we move a little bit further down the road with regard to racial equity at nonprofit organizations. We talk about nonprofit sector, the sector itself not being able to fully realize its potential. So if the opportunity is there, just like we try new things quite regularly, might the opportunity be there for us to try some of this stuff, because it might be a great addition to what goes on in the nonprofit sector and just humankind in general, just kind of getting back to civil society and being charitable in nature to serve humankind is all what I believe is at stake. Let me stop there and see if any questions that we can try to respond to.
Well, Dr. Taylor, there is one question in the chat that asks, how do you view a funder's role in this process? So I'll let you answer, and then I might have a couple of things to weigh in on that one too, from the philanthropy side.
I'm gonna say something real quick and let you have it. The literature just says, as we know, funders have a huge role because they have money. And let me stop there and let you go. But just as funders have for a long time, with having revenue available to support stuff, they can certainly help.
Absolutely. We know as nonprofits, we always want to please the funders. And if they are telling us we need to move in a direction, we'll pay attention. But one of the concerns that I've had in thinking about this over time is that we have to be careful as funders about the unintended consequences we might have. Because the crux of this work, it's so important to be authentic and to really build this into the culture of your organization. What I fear is if we have corporate social responsibility folks or private funders that decide they're going to, rather than just inquire about board diversity, but say they have a score that is changing how much funding somebody gets or determines whether or not someone gets funding based on a percentage of diverse board members. What I fear is that we'll go down this dangerous slope of getting people who check boxes. And that's not good for anybody involved. And, we want to make sure that we're encouraging as funders that we're in this for the long haul to support the nonprofit organization in doing this right and really bringing good DEI work into the whole part of their organization, not just, oops, I need to make sure I have one more Latina or one more Asian person or one more Black person on my board so we get funded. In my research, part of what I focused a little bit on was tokenism. And I think that's what is one of the unintended consequences that could lead to funders pushing this in the wrong way. We know we need to have at least 3 members of unrepresented populations in a group before they start feeling really comfortable in sharing their voice and feeling like they've been heard. And I think that's just something that I would encourage us to think about. Obviously, I get kind of passionate about that.
That's great. Thank you. Others, questions?
Kenny, I like, there's another one in the box here from Tirza asking about sort of the cost that people of color may experience in sort of trainings and in workshops as the more we sort of bring up some of these conversations. Sometimes people are at different levels of their comfort and clarity in regards to this. And I think at times there can be a sense that people of color are asked to either lead these things, roll into these things. There's a variety of elements, emotional costs as well. It's kind of an interesting question that's posed there. Just curious about your thoughts on some of that.
Yeah, I've seen a few things. I mean, it again, just in being honest, it's come up around here is I've been asked a couple of times, Kenny, are you sure you want to, kind of, dig into some of this stuff? And personally, I want to, but also our leaders around here have said, we want to make sure that we're watching out for you. And I can tell you that our students at the same time have said, it's not my responsibility for y'all to get this right. Because that's a heavy lift. So I think personally, it really depends. So it goes back to some of those conversations that I said that I've had with interviews for folks. Some are completely up for it. The thing that I can remember or go to is if you want someone to help you that's a person of color, ask them first, how would you feel about we're in a bad place, or we know we could be better. We know that there's some opportunity for us to get better. Is that something you feel like you could take on as the one or two people of color on our board? And how would you feel about that? And then depending on what type of response they provide, I've seen both sides. Some of them say, I would love to be that because that's what I do. That's my business. That's my practice. That's what I live for. And some, quite honestly, said, I don't want to be in that space at all because that's too heavy of a lift. So I think one, start with asking folks how they feel about that personally before you kind of get all built up to go make this big ask for someone to join you in that way. And I think that they'll give you an honest answer. Generally speaking, I've heard the same. It's just tough to for many folks that I've heard from that said, I don't want to be the one kind of leading the charge because that's just too much personally. And, I've, again, kind of said the same thing personally myself is, everything that I presented to you today, I don't want anyone on here to think that I'm a diversity or social justice expert. I'm learning as we go along, which is the reason why it's important for us to do this. But I've certainly learned a lot over the last few years that I think help some of these conversations that we're trying to have. I don't know if that gets to it, but whoever that was, if you want to ask a more specific question, lots of resources on here today.
There's another question, Dr. Taylor, that, let's see, it says their organization strongly focused on increasing diversity and equitable access in higher education. And she'd like to know how we can utilize this to retain accountability with external stakeholders, especially with career partners that may be looking to increase diversity at the surface level.
Oh, geez, I caught some of that, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe.
Yeah, Maggie asked the question. Maybe if Maggie's on here, she could. It's one of our former students, everybody.
What you get going on, Maggie?
Of course. Again, thank you for taking time to. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Perfect. My organization, again, is really focused on increasing diversity. We work directly with students, and we do have some career partners. And just to explain, we do have career partners who are looking to hire. We assist a really diverse group. And sometimes we want to ensure that we're maintaining accountability and that when they're looking to hire our scholars, it's not just to increase diversity and check a box. how do we work to maintain accountability and ensure that the organizations that we work with, not necessarily just inside the sector, but outside the sector, are also maintaining the same integrity and the same core values that we are as an org?
Yeah, so I'd certainly advocate for kind of what we went through today. I don't know to what extent, what types of questions you have for them, but I would assess their organizations. I imagine around here, I've certainly interacted with some corporations that they're over in Mays. I had one recently that they came to us because we have an event for Black Greek organization members, and they want access to for potential jobs and things like that. But my mind would go straight to kind of an equity assessment on some level. What questions do you have internally that you can then ask them to see how they respond, to give you a little bit more feedback on that. And especially in a role like how you described, I wouldn't be afraid. I would certainly be assertive and maybe posing some of those questions to them along the lines of, what are they doing? Tell me more about your mission. I'd love to see your policies and strategic plans as to how you grow students right out of college that are, potential employees of color. Like all of those things, I think are fair questions. I would associate it with, we don't want our graduate students off and running just to go off to any internship. Is there someone there that's going to guide them in that process? Who's going to supervise them? What are the outcomes that you want and the experience that they have? And again, I think those are all fair questions to ask if we're going to direct our students, whether it be for an internship and definitely for professional employment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
Of course, Maggie, good to see you. Just real quick, I know there may be more questions, so we're certainly available personally and as a team over here at the center. But just wanted to make sure as we come to a close that I reference, our educational opportunities and some of the upcoming events. Specifically, our next webinar will be on strategic planning that drives sustainability and impact. That's on April the 21st with Dr. Will Brown. We have our leadership and public service coming up in May. That's our 2-day in-person event that's coming up for nonprofit and public managers. And then we do have 2 continuing education online classes starting on April the 6th. If you have any interest in learning more about performance measurement or engaging your board and others in the fundraising process. Outside of that, I can stop the share. Maybe that way I could actually see who's asking questions, I guess.
I'm going to stop the recording, but people will hang on a few minutes.
Yeah, we'll hang out for a while. Yep.